time. All right, let me take care of my last task here and try to model what I've asked us all to do, which is briefly introduce our speakers. You know, as you all know, certainly, Bruce Babbitt was governor of Arizona. He was the Secretary of Interior. Just one of his many signature accomplishments as governor was the adoption of the 1980 Groundwater Management Act. And that was one of my first connections because I spent much of my career implementing that act. So for all of us at the Babbitt Center, it's a great pleasure to work on creating this center and having the opportunity to periodically talk with Bruce and get his wise counsel, and that has been enormously interesting for all of us. You'll also see, and you all got a copy of the Landlines magazine in your packet, and you'll see an interview with Bruce in there where he shares some of his wisdom for all of us. So at this point, please welcome me and please join me in welcoming Bruce to give us some introductory comments and share some of his wisdom on these issues he's long worked on.
Thank you, Jim. I've got to start off by sort of reflecting on the disconnect and really the irony of being an Arizonan back in Phoenix as part of a conference, a basin-wide conference, devoted to the idea that we can find consensus and positive solutions in the Colorado River Basin. Because historically, that has never been Arizona's view of the Colorado River Basin. And in fact, during much of my career, you really put your political career at risk by even suggesting that it might be useful to talk with Colorado and California and the other basin states, much less be seen inviting them to Phoenix to talk, because that just was not our history. We grew up in an adversary tradition that's both amusing, comical, and ultimately kind of self-defeating. When I cut my teeth in politics back in the waning days of the Lincoln administration, the idea of talking to California was just not there. You made your political career by waving the bloody shirt. And I cut my teeth in the waning days of that pre-Arizona versus California tradition. My great hero, of course, as I began to consider stepping into politics, was Carl Hayden. He was elected to the United States Congress as our sole representative in 1912 at statehood. There was one issue that Carl Hayden took to Washington, and that was Arizona is entitled to the lion's share of this river, and we ain't ever backing down, and we're not talking to anybody. We litigate and we advocate in Congress. He went in 1912, was elected again and again and again as Arizona persisted in this adversary course, losing again and again and again in the courts and elsewhere. But we kept electing Carl Hayden with one objective called the Central Arizona Project. The years went by from 1912 through the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s. We returned him every 6 years. In 1962, we had a political crisis. Hayden was up for re-election. The old gentleman had not been back to Arizona for many years. Nobody really had much firsthand experience. He just didn't seem to be necessary. And leading up to the 1962 election, a rumor started going around that Carl Hayden was actually dead. And it created an enormous hole, a potential hole and crisis in our position. And the venerable Arizona Republic reacted by sending a photographer to Washington to find Carl Hayden. And they finally tracked him down in the Bethesda Naval Hospital. The photographer got an incredible shot of him lying like a corpse in bed with his hand raised. That was it. And he was virtually unanimously sent back, and we ultimately got the Central Arizona Project. Now, enough of that, just by way of kind of reeling forward to tell you that we've really made enormous progress in this basin. We are learning to talk to each other, even in Arizona. Now, Mac and Katie told me I had 15 minutes. Now, I don't think any of you have ever heard a politician speak for just 15 minutes. So let me kind of see if I can be brief, but say some useful things, mostly at the 30,000 foot level, but let me see if I can start there and bring it to ground. I think we have to start with the news that we read every day right now, and that is the drought contingency plans, which are now being reviewed for congressional approval in Washington. The drought contingency plans are a remarkable achievement. We've got a lot to learn from them. It is quite extraordinary that we managed an agreement in which all of the basin states, but it was really about the lower basin states and very much about Arizona and California, actually forged an agreement, a pain-sharing agreement, for what will happen in the relative allocations if the drought projections continue on their current course. The framework of that plan is an extraordinary tribute to the quality of the water administrators in the basin states. We used to call them water engineers. They now have different titles. And to the Bureau of Reclamation, which did an extraordinary job of using its power to create a sense of urgency and necessity, in the absence of which the Bureau, as the water master of the lower basin, had the power to unilaterally impose a solution. A word about the press. I think it was really useful that we're finally developing what I would call, a press contingent of water buffaloes across the basin who are awakening to these issues and who are a little late coming to the actual negotiations over the last decade, but who in the final sprint toward getting approval did a terrific job of saying to the public, this is an extraordinary time. We must get this done, and beginning to sketch out to your respective audiences the potential downside of a failure to get it. Okay, now let me see if I can say a few words about the going forward in the afterglow of an extraordinary success and demonstration of the power of consensus building. There are an awful lot of loose ends, which I will skip over on my way to the next really big one, and that is the compact delivery obligation from the upper basin to the lower basin. This is a subject that we have scarcely talked about in recent decades. There's been sort of a sense that this one was so incendiary and so inflammable that we could just kind of put it off, and maybe it would never happen, and maybe the basin would never get to the point of such extremes of flow and climate change that we could just sort of say, well, maybe it won't be necessary. But what we've learned from the DCP discussions is we really have to anticipate the future. And there's a huge set of reasons to start talking about it now. It's a real simple issue. You can read the Colorado River Compact, and you ought to read it. It's about 5 pages long. It's actually written in plain English. It's full of misperceptions about how much water there was and all sorts of stuff. It's written clear back in 1922, but read it. It's got, a simple little mandate in it. The Upper Basin must deliver over a 10-year running period an average of 7.5 million acre-feet to the Lower Basin. The fact is, it's never that simple. What we learned from the DCP discussions is when you read a bunch of metrics in simple language, stop. There's always a backstory. And what we've got to do with the next big negotiation coming forward over the upper-lower basin stuff is start to educate the public about the backstory and where the ambiguities are and how we're going to use consensus-building process to avoid a real collision. There are legions of lawyers across this basin lusting for the lawsuit over the delivery obligation. There is a stack of literature 6 feet high, much of it generated by Colorado. And don't you think that's fair? For a whole variety of reasons, some of them very good. The Colorado crowd really like to think. They're really an intellectual crowd up there. They got a lot great programs. We're not into thinking in Arizona. We don't go for that. We're into fighting. But we got to take the Colorado discussion and broaden it out and get some public infrastructure underneath all of this about pathways to find consensus solutions. I believe they're there, but we can't wait until the last minute and then have a big crisis about how we do it. I think the role of the press in trying to work to plow the ground of understanding is going to be really important. Okay, now, some of you will note that I have taken my full 15 minutes back to talk only about water. Somebody say, where's the beef? Where's the land? You haven't said a word about land. And what that illustrates is there's kind of a duality here. The allocation issues, the compact issues, the Boulder Canyon Project Act, Arizona versus California, are all about water. That's kind of where we've always been. The question simply is, how do we divvy up the river? Who gets what share, how much, in what circumstances? And it's nobody's business how it's used. There has never in the history of all of this ever been a discussion of what are you doing with the water? That's not the way that we've thought about it. We're quarreling over our share. Okay, now, here's kind of the backstory that I think we really have to bear down on during the next couple of days, and then relate it back to this larger set of allocation issues. I had sort of thought, as I watched the DCP process go forward, that there would be some discussion, however carefully, into talking with each other about how are you using your share? What are the relative equities among all of the states in terms of how you're doing that? And to what extent could the allocation process up here of water be kind of a motivating force to generate intrastate backstory discussions about how we're actually using the water on the land. And I must tell you, it really didn't work that way. And I would invite you to kind of think about this over the next few days. Well, we have to start with Arizona. Well, what might have happened in Arizona, which is they're obviously taking the largest cut of all, would be some thoughtful discussion of how upcoming cuts could be equitably and logically distributed within Arizona by Arizonans in terms of reforming all of our water laws with a more intense and creative thought about how the land and the water come together, and getting into all of the issues of efficiency, conservation, reallocations, market process, all of that. But what happened in Arizona was interest groups reverted to the Arizona style, which says, we ain't giving up nothing, and we want more. And we are not going to join in approving this DCP until we get another slice of public subsidies and retrograde laws locking in the past. And Arizona finally stepped up to ratify the DCP. But if you look at what took place, it's not a very enlightening story. The public taxpayers of Arizona shelled out another $100 million to buy off a block of votes in the Arizona legislature from a county which will go unnamed, okay? And in the process, did nothing to resolve the problem of, we've got less water, what are we going to do? We're going to go back to pumping groundwater. And we're going to do it in the face of a state law which says you want to have a water management goal which moves the demand on the groundwater table down in order to have a rational future. None of that. No discussion at all of the other Arizona issues. We have lived off the Groundwater Management Act of 1980 for 40 years, saying, look what we did. We're the example for the entire West. Well, it was a great achievement, it's a fabulous achievement. I'm in Arizona. It's just a fabulous example of what can be done. It was done for 3 counties out of 14. In the other 11 counties, 12, 14, and the other dozen approximate counties, Arizona has no water management of any kind. We lost the opportunity in the debate moving up to get that linkage and simply reverted to the old one of, I want what I got and more, and I'm not approving anything until you get something. Now let me turn to California just to prove that I'm capable of waving the bloody shirt a little bit at California. But same problem in California. We have got an excruciatingly difficult question of how we manage the decline of the Salton Sea. It needs a lot of journalistic attention. Let me just say that. The proposals to remediate the Salton Sea are 1, not creative, 2, not adequate, number 3, they've not been funded, and number 4, in a strict sense, the Salton Sea issues do not affect California's allocation under the drought contingency plan. The Metropolitan Water District, to its great credit, stepped up and said, we've got to approve this DCP, and we're going to take the hit. And that leaves the specter of the Imperial Irrigation District this week in Arizona opposing the drought contingency plan, saying, we need $200 million for the Salton Sea. Well, the Salton Sea needs to be addressed, but it is not a part of the potential reductions that California takes under the drought contingency plan. Okay, I see Mac and Katie and Jim saying, you were invited for a few opening goodwill remarks. Let me just finish a little bit with the Upper Basin, because as we move into this next era of accounting for all of the possible scenarios that you're going to learn about, the Upper Basin issue is excruciatingly complicated. It is going to take an extraordinary amount of press attention defining the issues in order to frame a public discussion. And the issues have not been framed because they just haven't really been understood. Yes, there's a delivery obligation, but again, what are the intrastate implications of the various possible outcomes of the way the compact is interpreted? And what it does is set up a risk scenario in the Upper Basin states in which, and correct me if I get off track, you'll have your time here, in which every water development is subject to a risk scenario of, will the water be there in the worst of circumstances in some kind of delivery obligation, which is cloudy and needs a lot of effort. And that all feeds back into a risk analysis, which is just floating over the Upper Basin as kind of a cloud on the future. Needs a lot of journalistic attention. The journalists are starting to discover it, but explaining that to the public is just one example of the importance of this basin-wide discussion now, because we're all in it together, and there is no longer much upside in this kind of adversary, us versus them. Every issue, when you hear a lawyer say to you, it is beyond doubt that X applies to the way we apportion water in the basin, send them home, because it just doesn't work that way. Lastly, I would say, the urgency of getting into this Upper Basin thing is the Lower Basin success was really a two-state negotiation. The Upper Basin is going to be a seven-state and Mexico and tribal discussion. But the basin-wide DCP that we're talking about now is really Arizona and California, two states. Nevada, very helpfully, kind of in on the fringes. And it was a discussion driven by an extraordinary fact, and that is that the Bureau of Reclamation is the water master of the Lower Basin. It's an extraordinary fact that has occurred nowhere else in all of American history, and probably never will again, in which the Supreme Court of the United States overturned everybody's expectation and put the Department of the Interior inalterably in charge of the river, the Lower Basin. I've got to tell you, when that came down in 1965, I said, it's the apocalypse. It is the end of American government as we know it. They've trampled on states' rights. It's a vast federal bureaucracy. It's going to be the ruination of all our hopes and expectations. 10 years later, I'm the Secretary of the Interior. And I'm saying, wow, I love it. I love it. And I did. And my successors, for all of the differences, have handled that responsibility really, really well. We're not going to have it as we move into the upper basin. We're going to have, that is, go basin-wide. And we're going to have to think carefully about how we tamp down the adversary stuff, search for consensus. Remember that no rules were handed down from on high, and people of goodwill have still got space to make it work. Okay, I've used up my time, and somebody suggested I might take questions. I've got to tell you, the answer down here is no. This is a great opportunity. I will be around for the next couple of days, and I'd love to talk with any of you and learn a little bit in the process. Thanks.
Bruce, thank you very much. And one thing, Bruce, that you did mention that I loved you brought up when we were doing the interview was that, you know, this 19, 20-year drought, where maybe it's just ended or maybe we're getting a year, basically started as Bruce walked out of the Secretary of Interior office, and we've been in a drought ever since. So we need to get Bruce back, bring back a little more rain. But Bruce, thank you very much. Bruce promised he'd be controversial. I think he created a little bit of issues and controversy for us to really come back to as we talk about the DCP tomorrow.